Recording in progress.
Good morning, Tebogo. Alan Butle. How many members are in the platform?
Good morning, sir. We only have 3 members up to this far. Or 4. Miss Mautu has just joined.
Okay.
Hi, B. Hello? Morning, sir. We do have a quorum now. Good morning, sir.
Okay, let's start. Where are we? Thanks very much. The meeting is officially open, and welcome all the members who are in the platform. Welcome all our stakeholders who are coming to make submissions in regard to the bill that is before us. And welcome our support teams from Parliament and the media, everybody. Roll call and apologies. Do we have apologies?
No, we didn't receive any apologies.
I see the hand of Honorable Alexander.
Thank you, Chair. Can we put an apology for Dr. Burke, and then our alternates, Honourable Lundi, could we make him a full member for today, please?
Okay, Honorable Alexander.
Yeah, sorry to barge in, but apologies received from Honourable Lekhanyani. He's attending a meeting in Johannesburg, and Ms. Oleka Mazibuko is attending an appropriations meeting at the same time. Thank you.
Okay, those are the apologies. And then let's
Chair,
mode.
Chairperson. Sorry, I was trying to raise my hand.
Mazibuk.
Appropriations meeting is also sitting now, so I might have to leave early and join appropriations because those meetings are sitting at the same time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. It's a challenge that we have where we try to raise it with the chair of chairs, and we'll see how we deal with it moving forward. There we are. So let's move to item 3 on the public hearings. The purpose of today's meeting is to receive submissions from stakeholders on the bill that is before us, the South African Reserve, South African Reserve Bank Amendment Bill, B26, 2018. This is a private member's bill. The rules of the National Assembly do allow private members of the National Assembly to initiate a bill. It is provided for in 268 and 272, where in 272 it says a member who intends to initiate or prepare legislation in an individual capacity other than as a cabinet member or a deputy minister for introduction in the assembly, as contemplated in Rule 268, must prepare a draft bill and supporting memorandum setting out the objects of the bill in a form and style that complies with any prescribed requirements, including those set out in Rule 269, to Rule 279, and comply with Rule 276, or if it is proposed constitutional amendment, with Rule 295. Then it goes on as to the member who will be reimbursed for whatever money that he or she will have incurred. So this bill has gone through that process. There is a parliamentary team that assisted the private member of the EFF to draft this bill. The object of the bill is to amend the South African Reserve Bank Act 1989 so as to delete certain definitions, to insert a definition, to provide for the appointment of certain board directors by the minister, to provide for the tenure of office of appointed directors, to deal with the filling of casual vacancies for appointed directors, to make the state the sole holder of the shares in the bank, to repeal certain sections, to give the minister the power to appoint auditors of the bank, to give the minister the power to make regulations relating to the appointment of appointed directors, and to provide for matters connected therewith. That is the object of this bill, just to remind members, because this bill has been here since 2018, if I'm not mistaken. So there we are. Let's take the first stakeholder, that is Free SA. How many minutes, Teboka, are we allocating? Is it 15?
I gave them 20 minutes, sir.
20?
Yes, it's only 4 of them. Maybe we...
Okay. Free South Africa, there you are. You have got 20 minutes.
Chair,
Please.
unfortunately, sir, Mr. Maritz hasn't joined us yet. Sure why. The one who's supposed to present on behalf of Free SA. And I
Okay.
can't get hold of him. I had to send him an email. He doesn't have a number.
Okay. I think we'll try by all means to get hold of him. So it means we'll start with the South African Institute of Race Relations. So, Institute of Race Relations, 20 minutes.
Chair,
Who's speaking?
it's me, Chair. I tried to raise my hand.
Oh, Mautwe.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Good morning to you. Good morning to the colleagues. No, I just wanted to say you captured the background properly. What we intend to achieve and what not. All that was left was the voice of Honorable Malema on you, but otherwise, he's duly represented. Thank you, Chair.
So you want to give me the red overall now? Okay, now, thanks, Honorable Mautwe. Is the South African Institute of Race Relations here?
Yes, good morning, Chair.
Okay, good morning. You are allocated 20 minutes. Please.
Chair, could I ask, we have a technical challenge at the moment. We planned, according to the schedule, to present at 9:30. And I appreciate the chance to come in earlier to make up for another organization that isn't ready at this time. But I don't think it's going to work. We're going to be interrupted in a very noisy fashion that will make this impossible. Can we please stick to our time at 9:30 and have another group come in now?
Okay.
Thank you.
COSATU, comment, Matthew, are you there?
Good morning, Chair. My name's Tony Ehrenreich. I'll be doing the presentation for COSATU this morning.
Okay, comment, Tony, over to you. 20 minutes. Please time yourself. Put a stopwatch before you. 20 minutes.
Will do, Comrade Chair. We've asked the Secretariat to please assist us with just flighting our presentation, but as soon as they have it up, we'll proceed. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we proceed to the first slide, please? The next one, please. Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, comrades. And it gives COSATU a great pleasure to be here today to present our perspective on the South African Reserve Bank Amendment Bill. COSATU believed that for many years, the South African Reserve Bank's current ownership structure is an unjustifiable anomaly and must be rectified. And so, as the chair has correctly pointed out, since 2018, this matter had been up for consideration. And these are our comments in respect thereof. The ownership of the South African Reserve Bank must only be vested with the state in line with the international norms. We've looked at many countries and seen that what's happening in South Africa is outside of those general provisions. The functions of the South African Reserve Bank performs on behalf of the state and society is about controlling the currency, managing inflation, and overseeing the banking sector. These are of strategic importance, and they must only be performed by a public-owned institution, given the huge implications and ramifications it has on South African society and the economy. Next slide, please. We believe it is the norm on 99% of the world, including Europe, Asia, and many other industrialized economies, and that strengthens our call for the South African ownership to also change. The South African Reserve Bank's current ownership structure is an outlier, and for those reasons, we believe it's good practice and good order to bring it in line with international standings. We believe that there's no convincing justification that has ever been articulated as to why this exists in the South African situation and why it should be allowed to continue. COSATU's long-standing call has been reaffirmed not only at the COSATU National Congresses over many years, but also at the governing party's National Congress in 2017. In short, state ownership of the South African Reserve Bank is a tripartite alliance position which COSATU fully endorses, fully embraces, and hope that it will be taken forward by this committee into Parliament. The next slide, please. COSATU's concerns with the South African Reserve Bank over many years has centered around 4 key points. The first is the private ownership of the South African Reserve Bank that we believe, as has been stated, is an outlier, and we want to see that change. Secondly, the South African Reserve Bank's fixation on managing inflation, but not fulfilling the role it can and is legally obliged to play in protecting jobs, given our huge unemployment levels of around 42%, and stimulating economic growth, given the slow economic growth that we've seen over the last few years and continues to struggle. For years, the South African Reserve Bank has maintained an excessively conservative stance with regard to the repo rate, and we don't believe that this has been helpful for the other indicators around jobs and economic growth. The next slide, please. Whilst the economy has experienced tepid economic growth and increasing levels of inflation, the South African Reserve Bank has largely delayed easing pressure on consumers and the economy and maintained excessively high interest rates that have choked economic growth. COSATU welcomes the change of heart by the South African Reserve Bank during the COVID-19 pandemic to ease the pressure on consumers and the economy by slashing interest rates. But it should not have taken a pandemic and a global lockdown to encourage the South African Reserve Bank into action and in this direction. Next slide, please. We believe there should be an ongoing review by the Reserve Bank, and they should be ensuring that we stay in line with measures that promote economic growth and response to the challenge of jobs. The Minister of Finance needs to take a more proactive role in mandating the South African Reserve Bank to tackle inflation and unemployment and support economic growth. We can't only be fixated with one of those indicators. We've got to be mindful that our mandate is to respond to all of those. All are critical and none should be sacrificed for the others. So a balanced approach should be adopted to ensure that we're moving all of those indicators in the right direction. However, with the onset of the war in Ukraine and the rise in international oil prices and inflation, the South African Reserve Bank, we believe, had gone too far for too long a period in raising and maintaining excessively high repo rate levels. This has had a debilitating effect on the economy. Next slide, please. And this is measures that we believe the South African Reserve Bank can avoid. Thirdly, COSATU believes at times the South African Reserve Bank has not maintained a close enough eye on the conduct of the banks, nor of illicit financial flows. And we believe that's got to be an area of dedicated focus. This has come at the expense of workers and the economy, as banks have been allowed to fleece consumers with excessively high interest rates, collusion amongst the banks and other players, and currency manipulation, and flagrant abuses of the National Credit Act. Next slide, please. Fourthly, COSATU believes the Minister of Finance has stifled economic debate within the South African Reserve Bank by appointing what we see as only conservative economists as governors, deputy governors, and to his board. As COSATU and Labour, we believe there's a need to provide alternatives, and in particular progressive voices to the South African Reserve Bank's board. We believe that the vacancies that come up in future should be utilized to provide such alternative views, so to create space for alternative views on the board. We believe that this will help to provide a more balanced approach by the South African Reserve Bank to supporting both economic growth and job creation. And this would ensure a greater consideration of the challenges the economy that the Reserve Bank is responding to. Next slide, please. On the way forward, COSATU welcomes this bill and supports its passage. It will help initiate a long overdue debate in Parliament on how to effect public ownership of the Reserve Bank, which is a view that is strengthened within the society. Several critical questions need to be answered in this regard. Firstly, is the constitutionality of the bill. This was raised previously in Parliament, with particular regard to the state expropriation of privately owned shares in the South African Reserve Bank. There had been some advice previously. Next slide, please. And we believe that the changes that have taken place then has effectively dealt with that matter. The unconstitutional clauses cited previously at Parliament dealt with expropriation without compensation. We believe the Parliament has subsequently passed the Expropriation Act, which is now assented to by the President, and that bill deals with the constitutionality issue. We believe the South African Reserve Bank Amendment Bill thus passed this constitutional muster, and all the matters of expropriation are dealt with adequately by the Expropriation Act. Next slide, please. It is critical that government indicate how it intends to effect the widespread consensus that South African Reserve Bank must be owned by the state. This broad view of society has to be given effect by the legislative and by the ministry to ensure that we're able to take it forward. This includes what legislative amendments are required. Does the bill, in its present form, address all the necessary legislative amendments, and what additional amendments, if needed, are required and have been put forward? Government will also need to indicate what other administrative processes would need to be undertaken to transfer ownership to the state and by when. Next slide, please. This is a matter that is urgent, and the bill must be passed and done so with the necessary political maturity and sensitivity, given the important role that the South African Reserve Bank plays in the society and in directing the economy. It is a matter that will need to be taken into the fiscal space. It is a matter that will need to take into the fiscal space, that will take account into the fiscal case to address expropriation of the private shares of the Reserve Bank. This, however, we believe is an area that the minister can define in respect of a process to get there if there are fiscal constraints at the moment. Treasury will need to provide a detailed report to Parliament in this regard. So we want clear measures, timeframes, and a process that will be outlined to take that forward. The next slide, please. COSATU appreciates this matter will not be resolved overnight in the Standing Committee, that there are many areas that need to be taken into account. The Federation will avail itself for further engagement with the Standing and the Select Committees during that process, and will undertake to assist in whatever ways we can. COSATU makes its submission today and hopes that it will assist the Standing Committee with its critical task in resolving this long outstanding matter, and provide a clear and logical roadmap to ensure that ownership of the Reserve Bank lays with the state on behalf of the public, and that process of transformation is executed both by the ministry and the department. Can we move to the last slide, please? If that is the last slide, then Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity to do this presentation to the committee. We appreciate the opportunity and remain committed to assist the committee in any way we can to give effect to that. Over. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Comrade Tony, for the presentation and also having saved the time. Next, National Treasury.
Good morning, Honourable Chair. Good morning, Honourable Members. My name is Chris Axelson. I'm the DDG for Tax and Financial Sector Policy at the National Treasury. The National Treasury will be running the presentation, and we do have our SARB colleagues that are also in attendance, and they can add to our inputs as well, and they are also available to answer questions. I'll quickly share the slides. Other slides, can you see the slides?
Yes, please proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. So just to start on the role of the South African Reserve Bank, I mean, it is an institution, an organ of the state that was set up through the Constitution, Section 223. So it is a public institution. Its primary objective is to protect the value of the currency in the interest of balanced and sustainable economic growth in the Republic. It does have other objectives that it tries to fulfill, but in pursuit of its primary objective, it must perform its functions independently and without fear, favor, or prejudice. But there must be regular consultation between the bank and the cabinet member responsible for national financial matters, the Minister of Finance. It is also responsible for financial stability through the FSR Act. So what problem is this amendment bill trying to solve? So there has been comments already previously made that it isn't in line with how the central banks of most countries deal with their ownership. We have, 2 million shares that can be privately held. This bill aims to try and change that ownership of the 2 million shares to make it owned by the state, which will then change the shareholding structure to make the state the sole shareholder, and all those rights of those shareholders will then be exercised by the Minister of Finance. It does go a bit further. It also changes the governance arrangements to make sure that all the directors on the board are appointed by the Minister of Finance from a list confirmed by a panel. The panel does include the governor, a retired judge, as well as some members from NEDLAC. The minister will also appoint the auditors for the bank. And the bill doesn't directly change the mandate or the independence of the SARB. But there is no comfort that the current and future investors and savers won't see this as a first step towards changing the mandate of the SA Reserve Bank. The SARB is an incredibly important institution, as was mentioned, and any changes to its mandate, any changes in terms of political interference can have very large market swings. When we look at other countries and what they do in terms of the influence that is put upon their governors or the mandates of other central banks, it has very large repercussions for their currencies and investments. So we are always very sensitive about what we do with the SA Reserve Bank, about their independence, and about any perceptions in terms of their independence. So it's a critical institution. It plays a very important part of keeping the economy on a stable and sustainable footing, and to ensure that there is balanced and sustainable growth in line with its original objective. I've spoken a lot about that perception, and that is a lot of what we are worried about in terms of the negative signal that this might send to investors in terms of the control of the Reserve Bank. The main point in terms of the amendment bill that we are concerned about is the rights of the current shareholders in the SARB Act. As we've mentioned, the shareholders don't have any impact on the mandate or the policy operation of the SARB. But they do have some rights in terms of, for example, picking the auditors, as well as voting on some of the directors. But at the moment, those shareholders, and they do hold those shares, they've paid for those shares, there's no recognition of what will happen if from one day they hold those shares and the next day the state owns those shares. So how will that conversion take place? And at the moment, in terms of the bill, it would be a forced takeover of those SARB shares, like an expropriation of those shares. It doesn't say how we should fund those shares, and it simply assumes it can be expropriated. This also doesn't quite take into account bilateral investment treaties. So there are a small percentage of foreign shareholders. Foreign shareholders have no voting rights, but they are holding some shares. And in those bilateral investment treaties, if they were to be expropriated, it would go against those bilateral investment treaties. And those foreign investors could potentially take international legal recourse, and they would take South Africa to court in an international court. And our lawyers on the line can also expand on this if required, to then get reparations or get payment of damages for the expropriation of those shares, which would also have quite a negative impact in terms of the investment signal that we are trying to send. So changing the composition of ownership doesn't result in any material change in the current role of government. The current structure doesn't have an impact on the mandate and the independence of the SARB. So if we change that composition, it's not going to change how government interacts with the SARB. The powers of the board of the SARB, they really are limited to corporate governance. And the point of these shares in the first place was to try and get greater public interaction into the corporate governance of this public institution. All the other powers of the SARB Act that aren't linked to corporate governments, they've with the governor and with the 3 deputy governors. They have executive authority on all the other decisions, including in terms of the application of monetary policy within the SARB. So the majority of the directors on the SARB board are actually appointed by the president. The governor, the 3 deputy governors, there are 4 other directors. They're all appointed by the president. The shareholders then do appoint 7 of the 15 directors, so they don't have a majority. The government appointed directors hold the majority that are appointed by the president. And of those 7 that are appointed by the shareholders, it is subject to members are put forward by a panel. And the panel, as I mentioned, consists of the governor, a retired judge, 1 other person, I think, that is determined by the governor, as well as 3 representatives from NEDLAC. The panel then puts forward names to the shareholders, and the shareholders can then appoint. So government retains majority control over corporate governance, but those shareholders have a say in terms of which members that are put forward by the panel become the directors. So are there any consequences? Well, the main one that we did say is in terms of the compensation for those shares. There are also just general fears that this might be the first step towards changing the mandate of SARB, although this doesn't do it directly. If we start changing the act, if we start getting rid of corporate governance where public shareholders can come in to have a say on corporate governance, is this the first step towards greater interference, which, as I mentioned earlier, can create uncertainty and negative sentiment towards South Africa? It can also lead to fears about expropriation. If we are prepared to expropriate shares of private shareholders within the SARB, as well as foreign shareholders, does that mean that we will start expropriating further? Those are the concerns that we are generally worried about. These might have an impact on the economy. They might have an impact on investment. If we do need to deal with compensation, or if we are taken to international court through the bilateral investment treaties, there will be a cost associated with that, especially if there are payments for damages. We have raised concerns about constitutionality of the bill, even though there has been an amendment to the Expropriations Act. I think we are still concerned about those constitutional aspects. And we are not sure how this aligns with the other policy objectives of government. What are we really trying to achieve? Just in terms of the ownership structure, as we mentioned, Section 2021.1 shows that there are 2 million ordinary shares. That share capital may be increased with consent to the board. About 12.65% of those shares are held by foreign nationals, although they do not have a vote. And it's compiled annually and is available to the public. These are the sections in the bill that deal with those issues. There are limitations on those shareholdings. You cannot hold more than 10,000 for any single person. You get 1 vote per 200 shares that are held, and you can't deal with other shareholders and create groups and associates that aggregate those votes to act in a particular way. In terms of its current management and governance, Section 224 provides that SARB must discharge its duties and functions independently. There is regular consultation with the Minister of Finance, but that Minister of Finance doesn't have a say on operations. That vests with the governor and the deputy governors. The SARB management appointment process does have checks and balances. They are all appointed by the president, and the 7 directors are elected by the shareholders. We think the amendment to the bill would weaken the overall governance arrangements, and we think that it might lead to operational interference. So we do have objections to the bill. Government doesn't support the bill based on its constitutionality, the potential impact on investment and jobs, its lack of detail on the funding and the cost implications as well. And we're not sure it aligns with current policy objectives and funding priorities of government. In terms of the proposals of the bill, I've gone through a few of them. The shareholders to be divested of shares. There is another one on the restriction on SARB to form shares in a payment clearing and settlement system, which is another different change. We don't agree with that one either in the financial Sector Regulation Act, there is a requirement for SARB to be able to do this in terms of systemically important financial institutions. And if it's taken out of this bill, it will create uncertainty in relation to the other bill. In terms of the constitutionality of this, Section 25 of the Constitution does talk about expropriation, but it is subject to agreed compensation or approved by court, and the amount of compensation must be just and equitable, and it must include a consideration of its market value. The current bill doesn't take this into account. In terms of the economic implications, the foreign shareholders may be entitled to claim compensation under these bilateral investment treaties. We have seen some indication of shareholders actively instigating nationalization so that they can have access to a share of assets. There is one clause in the SARB Act that under liquidation, 40% of the assets could then flow to shareholders. And it looks as if some of them are trying to push that forward. So then if there is a court case, it could potentially lead to some of those reserves being applicable to foreign shareholders, which could have a much larger fiscal cost and would have long costs in terms of litigation and uncertainty around finalizing the matter. So the fiscus might then be exposed to these monetary claims, which would be an issue. And we would also worry about the uncertainty and the potential risks. There are also concerns about whether this would need to be a money bill. If we do need compensation for shareholders, money would need to be appropriated from the fiscus, and only the cabinet member responsible for financial matters can introduce such a bill, which would need to be a money bill. We did also mention quickly that Clause 7 prohibits the SARB from forming shares in a payment, clearing and settlement company, which would contradict some other legislation, and it could raise interpretation issues. Just to conclude, full ownership may be desirable, but it will potentially have cost implications and require significant trade-offs. There could potentially be a negative impact on investment and economic growth due to the uncertainty and the potential concerns of the impact on the independence of the SARB. Those perceptions are important. The bill doesn't address some of the key questions, including on the funding and on the economic impact. At the moment, we're stuck in a low growth trap. There are still fiscal challenges. We're trying to stabilize debt. So why risk both additional fiscal costs and reductions in investment or slowing growth even more? The governance arrangements could also be weaker, and it may negatively impact the independence of the SARB. So we don't support the bill. I can have any of my colleagues could come in, but otherwise they will be available for questions after this. Thank you very much, Honourable Chair.
Thank you, National Treasurer Chris. South African Institute of Race Relations, are you ready now?
Yes. The noise is gone. Thank you very much, Chair.
Over to you, 20 minutes. Please time us.
Okay, I will do so. Yeah, in a way, I think that a good use of our time would be to stop here and just replay the recording of the National Treasury submission there from Mr. Axelson. I'm sure the committee will be aware that it is not that often that a tabled bill that so reaches the heartland of the government is given that kind of measured but really quite critical response. So that's considerable, and we just start by giving a bit of pause to that consideration. Our written submission gets into a lot of technical detail, but what I want to do here for the committee is maybe move into a slightly more commonsensical approach. We hope that the committee will read the technical stuff, but I just want to say from a common sense perspective, if you come from my kind of perspective, you don't have a PhD in economics or financial management or the law. You just hear that someone wants to change the ownership structure of Saab. What does it make one think of? And I think that it's fair to say that ordinary South Africans like me, are going to think of what has come before, what is going on, what is like this. This is nationalization, changing the ownership structure so that the government is the sole shareholder. And I think the ordinary South African is quite aware that there are already many entities, state-owned enterprises, where the government is the sole shareholder. And South Africans are quite aware, and I'm sure this committee is actually full of members who are quite aware of the serious problems that have bedeviled state-owned enterprises. I think South Africans are quite aware of a thing called state capture. And I think we all are very used to hearing representatives from the government, whether it's from the legislature or the executive branch, saying, in effect, we need more private-public partnerships. That is one of the common phrases. Because where the state is the sole shareholder, it is a problem. Now, of course, I'm not trying to say that most South Africans want the government to go away and everything to be privatized. Not at all. Most South Africans really want the government to play a crucial and growing role in many spheres of life through better service delivery, and especially for the benefit of the most vulnerable members of our society. But I'm saying where the state is the sole shareholder, much more often than not, the push is towards bringing in the private sector. This is one of the very few instances, maybe the only instance, where the push is in the opposite direction. To push out all of the last elements of the private side. And as it's already been explained, the private sector's role in the Saab is a minority role. It's not a decisive role. It's not a controlling role. But this is one of those rare instances where even where there is a private-public partnership in effect, that much vaunted model of how we can all work together to make things better, the private sector is being pushed out so that the state will be the sole shareholder. And I think that if ordinary South Africans were very eager for more nationalization of more parts of the economy, we would see that through the representatives. But we hardly see that. We see much more the opposite of representatives saying, no, it mustn't just be the government. We need public-private partnerships. And so, here is a model that works. And so we say, please, listen to your own rhetoric as politicians. You've been saying you want public-private partnerships. Well, here is one that was already existing. So let's not break the one that is already existing, that is working. And it is working. I think as the governor of the Reserve Bank has pointed out, the historic average of inflation in the 80s and 90s was 15%. The Nationalist Party, the apartheid party, was not a very clever, it was not only morally profoundly corrupt and oppressive, there was also some brain malfunctions there. and one of those was in monetary management. By contrast, the South African Reserve Bank, under our 1996 Constitution, which makes a very clear provision for its establishment, 223, for its powers, 225, its responsibilities, its main duty, 224. This constitutional SARB has, by and large, hit its target of keeping inflation between 3 and 6%. So this private-public model has worked. It has worked much better than the thing that came before. In fact, I think if you were to go around and ask yourself which of the organs of state or institutions in government has worked best in the last 30 years consistently, give or take a few years, I think SARB would come out very high on that list, if not the top of that list. And we have some evidence to support that proposition. We're very happy to share that with the Commission. So, you know, it's one thing to take a broken organization that is clearly malfunctioning and to say we want to fix that. It is another thing to say we will survey the horizon and we will see that every SOE, almost every single SOE, is in dire straits, is looking to partially privatize because the debts can't be carried. But there is one institution there, a shining light on the hill, which is doing very good work. Let's bring that one down too. This does not make common sense. I'm not trying to appeal to very complicated ideas. Yeah, I'm appealing to a very simple idea. If a thing is working, don't break it. Look at all of the other cases that are like this, where you make the state the sole shareholder. Has that made it better or worse? Okay. That is my first point. My second point is that in the legislative record, the argument, one of the arguments put forward for the need for this bill is that it is unusual, not outstanding, certainly not unique, but it is unusual for there to be this kind of shareholdership structure. But we put it to the committee that the requirement is not that the SARB can't have anything unusual. It's that it must abide by the norms and standards. And the right question, we believe, is by international standards, is independence safeguarded? Our Constitution, in Chapter 2, says the Bill of Rights has to be read purposively. And we think it's trite that the whole of the Constitution has to be read purposively. So when you look at that requirement, the international proviso for the SARB, we say that must be interpreted purposively. What is the purpose? It is independence. And the specific purposes that independence is supposed to serve are enumerated in Section 224 of the Constitution. This is not a unique thing to South Africa, and it's not an original thing. Everyone knows this, but I'll just remind the committee what the basic understanding is. Since the successful historical analysis of the United States Great Depression, which involved a central bank failure that arguably facilitated World War II, the Holocaust and so on. The basic idea is that the Reserve Bank, if it brings interest rates down very quickly, will increase the money supply. And in the short term, that will produce a sugar high in the economy for maybe a year or two, where suddenly it's easier to borrow. So everyone is borrowing. So more things are happening. and it's quite nice for a minute. And whoever's in charge politically can gain from that. So if you time it just before an election, suddenly you get that sugar high and you do well. But then, sure as day follows night, major inflation impacts occur, and this is not controversial. And so you have a collapse that the hangover that is really doing much more harm than any good that might have come out of the sugar high. And because it is so predictable that you can do this, central banks around the world are given a sui generis independent status where they are state actors, they're state mandated, but they are kept at arm's length from the politically elected branches of government. And various countries we can go through the history have had central banks that have risen and then fallen and been replaced by new forms of central bank in order to satisfy this purpose, given this problem of, once you make this thing loyal just to the immediate legislators or the immediate executive, then you can press this button, suddenly you get 6 months of a sugar high, and then you get a big hangover. And that can be timed to some political end. So you want to keep it at arm's length. That is what 224 requires in a kind of layman sense. And that is the purpose of independence. And so the question that the committee must face in terms of this international comparative point is, does the current system frustrate or satisfy that purpose? We say that it satisfies that purpose, and there is nothing in the legislative record to say that it frustrates that purpose. No one has gone through the shareholding structure and said it is as a result of the shareholding structure that some politically malevolent or self-serving short-term exercise has been entertained that undermines this purpose. Rather, they've just said in a formulaic way, look, this is how the shareholding works in this many countries, and South Africa must be like that, without looking at that purpose. And okay. We think that if you apply the purpose of reading principle, which is very, very deeply embedded in our constitutional framework, you're going to face the right question and you're going to get the right answer. My third point is about process. In our written submission, we detail at great length for the committee's benefit how the process has been undermined. Section 59(1) of the Constitution provides for public role in this, and Chapter 10 is considerable in this regard too. And just to pick out the highlights here, the Parliamentary Budget Office raises some points of concern. Very much this point that I'm making, that a non-independent central bank can produce a sugar high, but also that the appearance that a central bank is moving in a non-independent direction can produce capital flight, disinvestment, major run-on effects. And even Treasury has just flagged this warning to the committee. So, in the face of that kind of warning, what's there really to be done? But the next problem is the fuller estimate of what these costs are has not been established. And we call on the committee to consider the new Clicks judgment of the Constitutional Court, where the court said, in effect, I'll just quote this actually. What matters is that a reasonable opportunity is offered to members of the public and all interested parties to know about the issues and to have an adequate say. And it's the knowing about the issues to start with that I think hasn't been fairly addressed. If you look at the socio-impact assessment that was basically forced to be produced by earlier findings of inadequacy in the process, you will not find the ability to know about the issues in play here. How much is this thing really going to cost? What is the real band estimate of negative impact on investor sentiment as a result of this? None of that has really been flighted. I mean, substantially, it's empty. The risks are noted and then left at that. There has been no real assessment of the potential impact. And so leaving the public in a position where we don't know about the issues from the perspective of the tabler of this bill. The more detailed problems with the process are enumerated in the written submission. I'm not going to go through all of that. My last point is on the expropriation issue. So already this bill, I think, seems likely to fail on constitutional grounds, just because if you don't follow the rules of the process, then the outcome is fatally flawed. But the input, the substance, is fatally flawed too. I mean, it provides effectively, this bill, for expropriation without compensation, which is not constitutional. The provisions of Section 25 are very clear on this. Compensation has to be bound by the agreement anchor, so it's either agreed or decided. But if it's decided by a court, it has to be based on the principle that this would have been agreeable. No compensation can never be agreeable. And it must be just and equitable. It's not just and equitable to uncompensate or undercompensate. The alternative is that, there's some idea, no, compensation will be provided through a disbursement mechanism that's sort of not really there, but just trust us, it will come through. And then we reiterate the point just raised by Treasury that, well, then this in effect serves as a money pool. And you've got these two-tier problems. The first problem is that the amount of money that this is going to cost hasn't been earmarked in the socioeconomic impact assessment. And secondly, that it's a direct appropriation, and that requires going through a different process to this one. So it's been wrongly tagged. Okay, I want to just finish by recognizing that the governor of the Reserve Bank, Lesetja Kganyago, has, really been very helpful, I think, in a way, to this committee by identifying the key issue. And I'm just going to read out a quote from him. Economic populism, this is from October 2018. Economic populism starts with deep dissatisfaction, too much unemployment, too much inequality, too much poverty. Just as an aside, this is not part of the quote. This is a big problem. I think all of the committee here, we all, all the members of the committee, all the inputters, we see the big problems in this country. We all really want to help that. I'm going back to the quote. The populist solution is to start spending, push as much demand as possible into the economy without consideration of constraints. The argument is that more spending will make people better off. More demand encourages more supply, meaning more jobs and more investment. It's supposed to be a virtuous circle. So the government starts spending money as much as possible. It borrows from people's pensions funds. It borrows from the central bank. It demands that it prints money to buy its bonds. It spends the foreign exchange reserves. And at first sight, it works. The immediate consequence of these policy tends to be an economic boom. There is more growth and big wage increase and more jobs. But it doesn't last. Time and again, the boom turns to bust. Inflation shoots up and growth collapses. The exchange rate depreciates and people keep raising their prices to keep ahead of inflation. A few years in, inflation is running at very high levels. This is poison to an economy. It destroys people's savings and shuts down longer-term credit markets. It also interferes with everyday business of buying and selling goods and services. So what starts with a nice growth bump ends in a deep depression and a large increase in poverty. We believe that this committee is not only bound by the Constitution to send us back for the process to be properly adhered to and for the compensation provisions to be properly considered, but also, just as South Africans, as patriots, as people who care about poverty, we believe this bill needs to be sent back to avoid compromising the independence of SARB in a way that the governor has very carefully warned is extremely likely to significantly add to deep depression and poverty. Thank you for the time, Chair.
Thank you. South African Institute of Race Relations. Tebuko, have you got hold of Free SA?
No, sir, they've still not responded.
Okay.
Because I can only communicate with them by email. They don't have a number that I can call them on.
No, okay. Let it be recorded that we were looking for them and they are nowhere to be found, so that they don't come back tomorrow and say, and say we have closed them out. There we are, honorable members. Those are the presentations. Now is the opportunity for members to engage the submissions. Questions, comments? Let's start with Honorable Maute, then Honorable Beasley.
Thank you very much, Chair. Once again, greetings to yourself, greetings to the colleagues and the stakeholders on the platform. Chair, let me welcome the presentation by the stakeholders, particularly the one from COSATU, which spoke indeed for the majority of Black people in this country who have not benefited anything out of the current structure of the Reserve Bank. Chair, let me also note the presentation from Treasury made by Chris, who says they don't support the bill. And really their fear is what could happen in the future. They are talking about the mandate of the Reserve Bank. We're not yet there, Chair. The amendment of the bill is not yet there. I think you outlined it very well. Maybe Chris was not on the platform because we can't speculate what could happen in the future. We're talking about what is before the committee at the moment. So really, the presentation for me does not cut it because it doesn't tell us what is the problem with giving some powers to the minister. What is the problem with the people of South Africa owning South African Reserve Bank? What is the problem with government being the sole shareholder on behalf of the 61 million people of South Africa? And I mean, if he was listening to Tony from COSATU, he outlined it very, he was very articulate in terms of what has been the challenge, what this bill seeks to achieve for the betterment of our people in the country. The less said about the SA Institution of Race Relations, the better, because there's no presentation. It's just, you know, a talk and a talk. So really there's nothing to engage from there. But Chair, to the South African Reserve Bank, which submitted their presentation, which was forwarded by the Secretariat, I've got a couple of questions. So the South African Reserve Bank claims that private shareholders have no real influence, yet they vote for directors and appoint auditors. So can they confirm whether there is absolutely no direct or soft influence that shareholders can exert over decisions or governance outcomes? Is the Reserve Bank willing to publish all correspondence, lobbying efforts, engagement initiated by private shareholders regarding policy direction or institutional changes? With regards to public-private institution, Chair, is the SRAB a public or private institution? If public, how do you justify the continued existence of private shareholders, especially when government itself holds no shares in the institution, where the minister does not have the power to appoint directors, like it is the case with state-owned entities, where the minister does not have the right to appoint auditors, like it is in other state-owned entities? And in terms of the shareholder interest in nationalization, SARP claims that foreign shareholders, including German nationals, are actively lobbying for nationalization to trigger compensation. So can the SARP submit evidence of these lobbying efforts or speculative acquisitions to this committee so that all of us, we can have the same view and the same understanding that SARP has? And how does SARP distinguish between genuine investor interest and speculative maneuvers aimed at triggering expropriation payouts? In terms of the revolving door influence, there is an observable trend of SARP deputy governors moving directly to private commercial banks. What safeguards exist to ensure this revolving door does not result in undue influence, preferential policy alignment, or insider access? So can the SARP share data on how many senior officials have joined commercial banks in the past 10 years after leaving the South African Reserve Bank? Chair, has the SARP conducted or commissioned evaluation of the cost required to bring all shares under full state ownership, including 1, domestic shareholder compensation, 2, foreign shareholder compensation under bilateral investment treaties, 3, can the SARP present a model of these potential costs and contrast it with the ongoing risk and administrative burdens of retaining private shareholders? Chair, the last one is on the constitutional and economic justification. So SARP argues that nationalization would be cosmetic and create no material change in government control. But if that is true, why does SARP and its shareholders resist it so vigorously? If you say to us, there will not be any change. So what is the problem when we want this thing to be in the state? Because there's no problem. You see that there's no problem. Secondly, is SARP not undermining Parliament's authority by preemptively labeling the amendment bill as unconstitutional and economically damaging without suggesting a constructive mechanism to transition to public ownership? What we are asking for, Chair, is can we be part of the world? The world has moved to reserve banks being owned solely by the state. What is the scene in South Africa asking for the same? And if SARP is saying it's unconstitutional, they are actually insulting our intelligence. We have the Parliamentary Budget Office here. We've got the legal office that has done extensively research on this subject, who came to us and said, actually, it is doable. It is done out there in the world. So why would SARP come and say and label this amendment bill as unconstitutional and economically damaging? So if they believe that it is unconstitutional, can they show us where it is unconstitutional? And are they saying the whole of the world is unconstitutional in asking for the Reserve Bank to be solely owned by the state? That will be all from my side, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Honorable Montreal. Honorable Beasley.
Thank you, Chair, and good day to colleagues and to other people on the platform. So my question is more about the actual shareholding. What are the value of the shares? How are they traded? I mean, can me, Ellen Beasley, as a private individual, acquire those shares? How are they traded? And what is the benefit if we've been advised that they don't have any rights? What is the benefit of actually holding those shares? And do we have an idea if government had to buy those shares back, what would the cost actually be? So I'll just be a greater understanding of that. And I think there's quite a lot of fear that the mandate of the Reserve Bank would be changed. But my understanding is that the mandate is set in the Constitution, so that would require a constitutional change. And then just perhaps more information. I mean, the key thing is the directors, because they set the policy of the Reserve Bank. 8 are appointed by the finance minister and another 7 are appointed by the panel. So do private shareholders not have an input as to who makes up that panel? Because it appears that it was the governor, Nedlac, and there was another party, I'm not too sure who it was, that actually determines the other 7. So if we can just have information about that panel, and then just clarification as a shareholder, what rights do you actually have? Because based on the presentation, it appears that you have little rights. And, so what is the actual objective of actually holding those shares? And then has any country in recent years gone from, say, private holdership to state ownership, or, just some information if this has happened to any country in recent history? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Beasley. Honorable Squati.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the presentations that have been made this morning, Chair. Just a few questions, particularly to National Treasury. I think the question has been, asked, but in a different form in terms of the potential cost of transferring private ownership to state ownership under the current legislative framework. And has the National Treasury evaluated this prospect? And the other issue is that whether the South African Revenue, the SARP, has effectively used its monetary policy instruments for balanced and sustainable growth from the Reserve Bank itself, and whether National Treasury is of the view of whether the monetary policy cannot have a debt stabilizing effect on government debt, and to institute of regulations, noting that both monetary and fiscal instruments have an impact on macroeconomic stability through various transmission channels. Is the IR of the view of that the monetary policy and the policy coordination should achieve government macroeconomic objectives? And is the coordination of monetary and fiscal policy optimal to respond to our national objectives? And the other one is in terms of the objective of the amendment, because it does not honestly show in terms of what material effect or change will this be able to bring about, except that it must be in a public ownership. It does not necessarily answer many of those questions. And I think COSATU as well. COSATU is really just reiterating what the amendment is all about, but it does not necessarily say these are the facts in terms of the Reserve Bank being in a public ownership. Besides the fact that it has been stated that the state is playing a major role. You've got the minister who appoints directors and so on and so on. And I'm just saying the materiality of bringing about the bill. What will it change, to bring about better life to our people and so on? And also, given the experiences that we have in South Africa in terms of SOEs, what is it that will be done differently to ensure that the South African Reserve Bank does not go that route and you then create calamity in the country? So those are some of the things that as much as it sounds a noble, a position or intention to undertake, but it does not necessarily answer a number of questions that would actually come in terms of the public ownership as versus this mixed ownership, where you've got the state and the private ownership of the bank. So those are some of the areas that I thought perhaps COSATU and who is it? I wouldn't say EFF, but those that are actually sponsoring the bill do not necessarily say this is so, except that we can expropriate it because now you've got the Expropriation Act that can be used. So for me, it does not honestly. It's except that you want to use state coercion. It does not necessarily answer why certain things should be done, because until we do that, until we answer that, so that we don't just do it because it's doable. We must then have proper facts to say why. Because the rest of the world is under this, but we are not necessarily like the rest of the world. We've got our own peculiar challenges. The rest of the world have got their own peculiar challenges that they're going through. But I'm just saying, in terms of our own local experiences, what is it that is there to make sure that we do not necessarily create undue challenges that were not necessary. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Squati. Honorable Van Rijn.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me welcome all the presentation that have been made, but also a very good morning to all who are in attendance, Chair. I hope Honorable Squati still remember what is the resolution of his political party on this matter, because listening to his submission, it seems to be deviating from that resolution. But anyway, let me focus my submission on the bill that is in front of this committee. Chair, I think the bill, even before it was introduced to the committee, or maybe to the parliamentary process, there have been serious discussions nationally around the Reserve Bank, of course, as governed by the act that we are currently trying to amend. So what I'm trying to bring to the attention of the committee is that this discussion is a very old discussion, and the fact that it was officially introduced to Parliament process in 2018, and up to now we haven't Parliament haven't resolved this on this matter. It's a serious concern to MK Party, and that's why my questions will mainly focus on the process, because we want to understand 7 years hitherto since this was the bill was introduced, the matter has not been brought to its logical conclusion. What might have happened? Because we think that there are lessons to be learned from this process that was introduced in 2018, and up to now, the process hasn't yielded anything. Maybe if we can be taken through that question of what happened, so as we are able to learn from the experience of these 7 years. But also, Chair, maybe through your guidance, could you please outline the process that must be followed for this discussion to be brought to its logical conclusion? Because as I've indicated, this discussion has been going on for quite some time. What must be done now? What is the role? What is the expected role of a National Treasury in bringing this matter to its logical conclusion? What is the expected role of the Standing Committee of Finance, our role in bringing this matter to its logical conclusion? Because I think this matter has been discussed, and leaving it maybe in wrong hands for it to be finalized might be the cause. And that's why we are saying, as MK Party, it will be important that we have a clear process as a committee that we are obviously adhere to, and make sure that we follow to bring this process to its logical conclusion. Because our people, have heard our debates. These debates have been taking place for more than a decade now, So I think it's important that we provide direction on this matter. They know what is COSATU's position. They know what is the ANC position. They know what is EFF position. They know what is MK position since our our entrance into the political landscape of South Africa. The issue is how do we bring this matter to its logical conclusion. National Treasury has said it very clear as the proxy of white capital that those who want the Reserve Bank to be nationalized, of course, they are viewed as hyenas who are standing at the door to grab what is remaining of the National Reserve Bank, So basically, those positions are known. The issue is in terms of legislation, we are empowered to effect amendments. Now, this process is not moving. So we really need clarity on a clear and a simplified process that needs to be followed, to bring this discussion to its logical conclusion. Because our discussions, our submission to a large extent, I think they've become banal now. Our people know what is our position. They just want to know how do we bring this matter to its logical conclusion without allowing any stakeholder to impede or to stall this process. So I think as a committee chair, it will be important if we can get to know the process that we need to follow. These public hearings, after public hearings, what is going to happen, who will be doing what, and all that. Because I think since the process was introduced, 7 years is a long period. We really need to bring this matter to its logical conclusion. And hence, as MK Party, we are calling for a simplified process of driving this legislative process, Chair, without necessarily having to repeat ourselves over our positions that are well known internationally and here at home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Van Rooyen. Honorable Tambo.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all those who have made their presentations. Brief, the Honorable Maudwe dealt with a lot of the very specific and direct questions. The notion of an independent South African Reserve Bank. So this conception that institutions that ought to be instruments of either fiscal policy in the form of national treasury or monetary policy and policy direction in terms of the South African Reserve Bank must be independent is something that I think we must speak to politically, because it forms part and parcel of a lot of fear mongering that stifles economic development in this country. And I think it is why we find ourselves where we find ourselves today, because there is this insistence of stating that institutions that ought to drive economic development must be independent. And the question that I think we must begin to ask, and I want to pose to all of those who presented today, is they must be independent from whom and for what purpose? So when you say the development of monetary policy, which will guide economic development, intervene in unemployment and stagnant economic growth, must be independent, who must it be independent from? Are you saying the South African Reserve Bank must not have any influence from public representatives or government which represents the people of South Africa, who this Reserve Bank is supposed to service in terms of how it develops monetary policy? So I want us to have a serious discussion about the conception of independence that is always being mooted when we're talking either to National Treasury. I remember now when we were dealing with the budget process, there was a lot of phrase mongering about Treasury being under attack, its independence being threatened. Independence from whom and to serve what purpose? Because it has been so-called independent now, and we're sitting with the unemployment that is spiraling out of control, stagnant economic growth, and a massive deindustrialization that has faced our country, which also contributes to the numbers of unemployment. So I want us to have a serious discussion, and those who are mooting this concept of independence must explain to us, what purpose does this independence serve? What exactly is the threat to the South African Reserve Bank if the shareholding belongs to government? What is it that you anticipate would threaten the South African Reserve Bank or its mooted independence? And I'm curious about it, because the suggestion, I think, an implication is that you are saying that the South African Reserve Bank and other institutions that direct monetary and fiscal policy must be independent from inputs of public representatives who are elected by the people of South Africa. Now, I do not know whose interests this independence serves, as it has been so frequently mooted. So I want us to deal with that, because it is part and parcel of fear mongering that I think stifles a lot of necessary change in terms of how we guide economic policy in South Africa. The same can be said about the narrative. So there's narrative building rather than direct confrontation with legislative proposals. There's narrative formulation about how the South African Reserve Bank nationalization will lead to capital flight, will lead to a loss in investor confidence, but no one is ever able to quantify. And this speaks to even expropriation of land without compensation. This speaks to the transformation fund. All progressive pieces of legislation are always being covered in a narrative formulation of there will be capital flight, there will be investor confidence losses that will harm the economy, but there's never anyone who's ever able to quantify these things. So it's speculative fear mongering that is always pulled out of the pocket when we're trying to guide the developmental mandate of institutions in this country while we're seeing our economy basically stagnate and go on the brink of collapse. So can anyone, because we're being asked here to, how will we quantify the value of shares? How will we quantify compensation if there will be so? Can there be a quantification of the losses in terms of capital flight and investor confidence that will occur should we proceed with this progressive piece of legislation? Because the burden of quantifying things is always being placed on those who are trying to develop mechanisms to grow our economy and guide monetary policy in a manner that will develop our economy. So can we get a quantification of these threats that are constantly being bandied around? I don't want to talk too much about the comparisons between how SOEs have gone in the past decade and a half due to mismanagement by government, because I think it is a slippery slope that we must not try to go into, because it concerns me. It means that we are expressing an inherent distrust of government to run any institution. And if we proceed in that manner, then we're going to end up privatizing all functions in South African society. So the public-private partnership theorem that has emerged recently is part and parcel of this inherent distrust of government running institutions due to the failures of a regime that was in charge for the past decade and a half, and perhaps since 1994. Now, I do not think that the incompetence of those who have run SOEs since the democratic dispensation should then inform the fact that we must essentially allow the private sector to run South Africa like a private corporation. I think it's a misguided notion. I think it's a false equivalent that we must not allow ourselves to fall into. And those who belong to political parties who are governing are astounding to me, because they're expressing a lack of confidence in themselves. The African National Congress and Democratic Alliance are governing South Africa. And they are trying to say to us to avoid the collapse of the South African Reserve Bank in the same way that we've seen with state-owned entities. We must allow private shareholding to continue. And that is an expression of lack of confidence in themselves. So I'm not sure why they are creating this false equivalence. And I think it's something that is dangerous in terms of how things are structured now. And I think that the second last point I want to raise as well is, why has the South African Reserve Bank stopped publishing the shareholders list? And so I saw earlier in the presentation that they say it's publicly available. Treasury says it's publicly available in terms of the shareholders index. But if you go to that website now, the last report in terms of shareholders index, which has been published, is from 2021. So why has this list ceased to be published, and where and when was this decision taken? Because if we can use our own logic, we can surmise that once the process of fast-tracking the nationalization of the South African Reserve Bank came through this bill presented by the president of the EFF, there seems to be some unwarranted or questionable secrecy. And another thing that we are going to do, and we'll expect a detailed response, is how much has the South African Reserve Bank paid to private banks in interest since the shift to shortage-based framework to surplus-based framework? So we need a detailed report, and perhaps starting from 2022, of how much the SRB has paid to private banks in interest since the shift to shortage-based framework to surplus-based framework. Because we also suspect that this is part and parcel of the reason why the Reserve Bank is against the amendment of the Act to put the Reserve Bank under state control. The relationship, and the Honorable Mautwe spoke to it as well, between the Reserve Bank and the commercial banks is something that we're beginning to suspect is nefarious. And the trend she spoke to as well of deputy governors moving directly from commercial banks once their tenures are finished from the Reserve Bank is part and parcel of the reason why we think this needs state guidance and state control as things are currently standing. But I'm interested in a conceptual conversation as to why do we insist on independence, and independence from whom, to serve what purpose? And with those conceptual questions, and I think I'm posing that to Treasury, perhaps the South African Institute for Race Relations as well. I don't want to speak too much about my own perception of that institute politically and whose their presentation represents. But I'm interested because you build a lot of narratives without any substantiation. And I think now there needs to be much more deeper responsibility to explain and quantify the fears that we generate when certain pieces of legislation are being proposed in Parliament. Thank you, Chair. Am I still here? Am I still in the meeting? Chair, I'm done.
Okay, Honorable Tambo, thanks. Honorable Mazibuko.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Chair, let me start by
Okay, no,
saying,
I wanted to check that process. Yeah, because quite some time, that time when Shibambo was still around, the bill was tabled. We
Chair.
debated it, isn't it? Oh, Honorable Mazibuko, sorry, I was getting clarity on something. That it's your opportunity now to contribute.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I thought maybe there's something wrong with my.
Sorry for that.
Okay. Okay, Chair. Now, Chairperson, let me start by saying this process of engagement with the stakeholders, for me, it should help us as lawmakers to identify laws and policies that we need to change more than us wearing our party regalias and motivating for our parties and demotivating other parties. But it should help us to say, as a collective, parliamentarians and representatives of the people, where we can assist these stakeholders as they present to us, which then brings me to the question to both COSATU and IEJ on what aspects need to be strengthened within the monetary and fiscal coordination, and which transmission channels and instruments can be enhanced if they could help us there, so that when we go back to Parliament, at least we motivate for this. And IEJ has identified the weaknesses of monetary and fiscal policy coordination as a major weaknesses. What is the position of the IEJ on the monetary policy goal responsibility of government? And is the government currently optimally utilizing this responsibility to accelerate economic growth and increase low-cost capital for industrial development? Because if we don't work towards acceleration of economic growth, all these challenges we are having as a country are not going to be resolved now. The priority of the current government is to deal with the issues of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And if we don't move in terms of economic growth with all the macro challenges we're having, that will not assist us. And my last question, Chair, on the Institute of Race and Relations, noting that both monetary and fiscal policy instruments have an impact on the macroeconomic stability, as I said, through various transition channels, is the IRR of the view that monetary policy and fiscal policy coordination should achieve government macroeconomic objectives? And is the coordination of monetary and fiscal policy responding to our national objectives? Because for me, I think we need to seek solution more than complaints, Chairperson. I thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Mazibuko. Let's go back to the stakeholders. I will explain the process, what happened to in terms of processing this bill up to so far, after stakeholders will have responded. Let's start with COSATU. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for the responses from both the parliamentarians and from the Treasury. Chair, I think we've outlined our position in respect of what our concerns are and what our ambitions are. We're clear that we think that the ministry has to manage that in respect of the quantums that's involved. But I think a lot of the questions that are raised brings us to the point of what is the objectives about monetary and fiscal policy? What is the role of the Reserve Bank? And I know that the reflections today had reflected different views on both what monetary and fiscal policy had achieved and the role of the institutions in achieving that. Now, our sense is, Chair, that South Africa today is a more unequal society than it was in 1994. Unemployment levels are around 42%, and the levels of poverty are deepening. Now, clearly, our financial institutions are not helping us to respond to the essential fault lines caused by apartheid, underinvestment, and corruption. No doubt played a part in that. But that's what we've got to respond to. In responding to that, there's no doubt that different constituencies have different interests. Some constituencies have an interest to just make sure that the economy remains exactly as the same as it was under apartheid, because it had supported them and it had supported the financialization of our economy. So, of course, the maintenance of that does serve the needs of certain stakeholders, and I would argue those who benefited more from before 1994 than those benefiting after 1994. The ambition of the majority of society is that that trajectory that we've been put on since 1994 and the role that the South African Reserve Bank has played has not responded to the essential challenges confronting our society. So that role must be reviewed. The way that the institution functions, the way it's structured, has to be reviewed, and there should be no holy cows. But our starting point is that those who have suffered under apartheid and who believes we need to put the economy on a different trajectory, believes that the institutions can't remain as they were and they can't serve the interests that they served before 1994. Of course, those who benefited that will come here and say that, no, leave it exactly as it is because that served us well in the past. And as long as it doesn't change and transform society, it continues to serve our interest. So our position remains, Chair, that we think the ministry must look at the quantum affected and the process to bring about that change. But our view in respect of the change remains unchanged by the comments that have been made. And we remain committed to work with the department and government to achieve a more effective Reserve Bank, one that speaks to the needs of the majority of South Africans, and one that ensures, whilst it looks at inflation rates, also looks primarily at the issue of jobs and economic growth. Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity.
Thanks, Comrade Tony. Who's next? The National Treasurer.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. I think Saab will come in first.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Rebecca T, and I am the General Counsel from the South African Reserve Bank. I hope I am audible. Thank you for the opportunity, Chair, and thank you very much for the questions. Chair, there are many questions. On the matters of policy and on the matters of independence and monetary policy, the SARB will be presenting its annual report in due course, and the governor will then address all those questions, and also all the other matters of policy that have been raised here. On the question that was raised as to whether SARB is a public or a private institution, we want to unequivocally state that SARB is indeed a public institution. And we also want to confirm, Chair, that the private shareholders do not have real influence on SARB and the operations thereof. And in respect of the register of shareholders, that register is sent the SARB by obligation, obliged by the law, is required to submit that register of shareholders to the Minister of Finance, who then in turn tables it before the Parliament. We are constrained by the privacy provisions in the Papaya Act, and that is the reason why it has then removed from our website, but it becomes public by virtue of us it being tabled before Parliament in terms of Section 31 of the Act. I think, Chair, that is the sum total of the questions I can answer at this point, and then I'll hand over to the National Treasury. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Honourable Chair. I'll come in with a couple of the other ones. I think the main point here is about the expropriation of the current shareholders. So that is our largest concern. You know, the Act takes a position where one day their shareholders have shares, the next day the state owns the shares, and there's no mechanism for compensation, there's no mediation, there's no agreement. It is expropriation of those shares. And that is it's an issue, and I know that they were concerned about the constitutionality and that we can't prejudge what is constitutional or not, but that is a concern from a constitutional perspective. I do also note the points from Honourable Mawatwe on we shouldn't be thinking about the fear or what might happen. We do want to reiterate, though, perceptions are incredibly important here. As we've seen in the Expropriations Act from last year, although the Expropriation Act is very closely in line with a lot of international legislation, it was seen in a very bad light, especially in the US, and it had some consequences for us. So, if there is no clear benefit in terms of what you are getting from an amendment, why take the risk of these negative perceptions, which then do have a real impact on investments? They do have a real impact on the currency. I know that there was also questions about what about the quantification of those amounts? And you can see, especially in other countries, and you can see from our past as well, when there are large negative events, there are very serious implications for the currency, which can lead to much higher fuel prices, leads to higher inflation, and it has a real impact on the person in the street. If I go through some of the other points, there was a question on, what is the benefit of holding those shares? As we said in our slides, the shareholders can then vote on appointments of directors, and there are a couple of questions about that they can determine the 7 directors, but they are not determining those 7 directors. They are choosing from the directors that are put forward by the panel. So in the Act, and I think it's section 4(1)(d), it talks about the panel then puts forward potential directors, which includes the governor, retired judge, and representatives from NEDLAC. So those private shareholders are not determining who they can put on the board at all. They are choosing from a select number of people that the panel chooses, where the governor sits on the panel as well as that retired judge and the NEDLAC representatives. There was a very interesting point about independence, and I think that is something that the committee needs to think about. Here, the SARB is not completely independent to do whatever it wants from a monetary policy perspective. It is provided direction by the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Finance helps to set what the monetary policy objective of the SARB is. So, for example, the inflation targeting regime was put towards the SARB by the Minister of Finance, but they are then independent in terms of how they achieve that inflation target, so that politicians cannot then influence monetary policy at a particular time that they would like. They are independent in achieving what the overall objective is that is then put forward by the Minister of Finance. They're also not completely independent in that they have to abide by the clause in the Constitution in terms of why they were set up. So it's similar in terms of other institutions. If you look at SARS, the Minister of Finance provides the legislative framework for taxes, but then the Commissioner of SARS is independent in terms of how he administers those. And there's no political interference in that to help with good governance and make sure that there are not unacceptable outcomes there. So that is the way that we look at the independence, that the direction is provided, but in terms of how they do it, and they are independent. And then there were quite a few other questions from SARB, which Rebecca has touched on. If there are others, Chair, that we've missed, I'm happy to come back to them, but I think that does cover from our side. Thank you.
Thank you. Institute of Race Relations.
Thank you, Chair. I'll just go through them. Thanks again for the opportunity to present. One of the committee members didn't want to respond because we didn't do a slideshow. We can provide a slideshow summarizing our written submission to that member, if that would help her. On the question of cost raised by another member, our written submission indicates, and I think other representatives have said, the Parliamentary Budget Office estimated that the cost of buying out the shares, which again is not provided for, would be 20 million rand. And so that indicates like that's the kind of cost that could be borne by the fisc through an appropriation through the proper channels, which have not been undertaken here. The PBO also identifies the bigger cost, and the exact wording is in our written submission. The bigger cost is from the financial implications that result from this exercise. So that's both of those costs matter. The first cost matter because it's sort of hard to tell, like, why would you liquidate or expropriate these shares without compensating that amount, if that amount is the kind of amount that could be affordable by maybe docking allowances for members of parliament or something. A little bit, you can get that 20 million together. Why wasn't that provided for? There doesn't seem to be a good answer to that, and we press the committee to try and apply its mind to that. Okay. The next, but the bigger cost is the financial implication to the state, to the people of South Africa in general. On the mandate, I think one of the members raised the point that the Constitution sets the mandate. Section 224 says what the primary object of the SARB is. And so you can't change that without changing the Constitution. And we agree. We just want to underline the difference between the mandate and the mechanism to implement or oversee the achievement of the mandate. And this changes that. We see the current mechanism as being satisfactory to satisfy the mandate. And, you know, you look at the mandate, the primary object of SARB is to protect the value of the currency in the interest of balanced and sustainable growth. Protecting the value of the currency, that's a measure of inflation. And the target has been set for 25 years, and overwhelmingly, it's been South Africa stayed within that target. So there's no understanding of, and I think that's been put to this committee sort of explains how that mandate hasn't been satisfied, the system is broken, you need to fix it. Instead, the system is working in terms of that mandate. And the mechanism is being changed, and that's why we're worried. Why change a mechanism that is satisfying the mandate? Well, perhaps to undermine the satisfaction of the mandate, that's the concern. That's the concern raised by other examples of state capture. Members say, okay, raised a very good point. The don't just do it because you can. You know, the point of legislation is supposed to achieve a proper purpose, and we still can't understand what the proper purpose here is. The local solutions for local problems, I'm kind of paraphrasing there. I think that really gets to the nub of it. It's like, in terms of this international comparative point, you need to look at the local problems and what are the local solutions to those local problems. And the current system seems to be the solution to those problems. Again, as exemplified by the fact that SARB is a very credible organization that's well respected by most people, and that has been achieving its mandate as set out in legislation, subordinate legislation, and the Constitution itself. And again, there's no evidence to show that it hasn't done that. On the alignment of macro monetary and fiscal objectives, that point is raised by two members. I'm going to consolidate those in my last response. Now, a question that is directly posed to us is, what conditions locally mitigate against harm? And, you know, our answer is the conditions that locally mitigate against harm as is are this distributed balance of interests, where the state, there's a public organization, the state plays the decisive role, but where members, private shareholders have the right to play a role in electing 7 of the 15 non-executive directors, and so this is a mediated input, and it's a minority input, but it is some non-operational input that has a contribution to the mechanism that satisfies the mandate. There was a question about what went wrong. I know the chair is going to address that directly. I just want to highlight from our written submissions, why has this bill taken so long? Just want to highlight from our side, if I may, that the initial memorandum of objectives stated that the financial implication to the state would be none. It's an absurd proposition, which I think shows something about the initial framing. And in 2023, the Parliamentary Budgetary Office was then called upon to produce a socioeconomic impact assessment. And I think that part of the idea is to like fill in this pretty absurd gap. And the PBO did find that there would obviously be financial implications. But there was a Parliament lapsed. The PBO was requested in 2023, but then Parliament lapsed, it was resurrected. And so that's part of the reason for the delay. And that speaks to this point of like, well, then did the PBO actually do its job? Because I understand members are hasty. I understand members want to get through this process. But, there's this constitutional requirement that the process is not just a box checking exercise, that it's a real mindful engagement with the facts. And those facts aren't in front of the committee in the sense that the socioeconomic impact assessment doesn't, in an evidence-based way, materially unpack what, to the best of, an expert's ability, what are the broader costs in a way that can be cognized, in a justiciable, cognizable way. There's rather this like vague warning. We agree there's a problem with these vague warnings. And there hasn't been effort to really concretize that. So like with the warning, you can't go forward. You need to go back and say, well, help us concretize this. Let's see how much is this going to cost in the broader terms. There is this direct question put to us further. It's like independent. We talk about independence. Independence from whom and for what purpose? Well, the purpose of the independence is, I'm going to read it again, it's the Constitution that provides the purpose. The primary object of SARB is to protect the value of the currency in the interest of balanced and sustainable economic growth in the Republic. So that's the purpose. Independence needs to be secured insofar as it satisfies that purpose. And, I spoke at quite some length, so I won't go over it again, but the idea really is one of timing. The elected representatives of government absolutely have an interest in participating in the process, including through electing a president who then elects governors and appoints the Minister of Finance, who all play a role in setting up the inflation target. That is a very long-term, broad strokes input, but it's a huge input. It's the most important input. We'd be in a very different country if the target had been set at 16% rather than 3 to 6%. So there is an input from the state, from the people's representatives. We're not crazy libertarians. We live in a democracy, a constitutional democracy. People elect representatives, and those representatives have an input. They set the terms that SARB goes for. What is guarded against in terms of independence is a short-termist thing, is a thing where you put your finger on the button now. You say, drop interest rates now by half. And you can see other countries that have done this. Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, Venezuela, we detail these accounts. You can look in the contemporary interactions in the US. Huge pressure is applied on reserve banks to push the button now, because in the short, you can get a sugar high with a huge hangover afterwards. And that's the independence that needs to be, independence needs to guard against that. So I've said what the purpose is. It's provided by 224 of the Constitution. Said from whom? From any politician that undermines that purpose by engaging in a short-termist frustration of 224's interest, which is preserving the currency in the interest of economic growth. Unemployment was mentioned, low growth, deindustrialization. And the question was asked, isn't this to blame on SARB satisfying its mandate, achieving within inflation target inflation for most of the time? No. Our submission is that the reason black unemployment has doubled, more than doubled from 2007 to date, from on the expanded definition 5.5 million to well over 11 million. And the reason that unemployment overall has increased so dramatically and that there's been no growth since 2008, it's not based on narrative. It's based on hard evidence provided by the Harvard Growth Lab, the IMF, the World Bank, the Zondo report, as well as investigations of the fiscal multiplier that are all in our written submission. And the evidence there, just, the nub of it, is that the preferential procurement system, state capture, broad corruption, avoidable corruption, on a policy front, on an implementation front, have coalesced to produce the situation where the fiscal multipliers quantitatively assessed are such that the marginal extra rand that the government spend is literally destroying economic value. And so, releasing more money into state spending through loose monetary policy will just precipitate even greater collapse. And we can see that by the shift in debt repayments from where they were to being, by some measures, the highest line item in the budget. So that addresses the point about capital flight and fear-mongering from a quantitative perspective. We haven't been grounding our assessment in emotions. We've been grounding it in contemporary and historical fact, and those are carefully laid out in our written submissions. But the honourable member said, in terms of this question of cost, of fear-mongering, of capital flight, of the risk that this bill would impose on ordinary South Africans who want to buy petrol at the same price rather than a higher price. The word burden was used. The burden, who bears the burden of quantifying this risk? Is the burden placed on us, or is the burden placed on the bill's tabler and the committee that is considering the bill? And we submit that under section 59(1) of the Constitution, chapter 10, and in particular in light of the NUCLIX judgment that I read a section from earlier, the burden is on the state to provide all the relevant information so that, quote, the people can know what the issues are that are at stake. We don't know. We know enough to see the risk. That has already been identified. It's been identified by the governor of the Reserve Bank. It's been identified by the PBO. It's been identified by the compendium of local and international evidence. The quantity of the risk, the extent of the risk, that is not fully known. And the burden is on the part of the legislature, in fact, to know it in order to knowingly satisfy the public participation process. The notion that public-private partnerships rely on inherent distrust in government is rejected. It was tabled. There must be trust in government. One of the organs of state or constitutional institutions that has performed well has been the SARB. It is a public institution. That shows from our side, we have trust in government. We have seen it perform well. And when you perform well over time, you earn trust. This model has earned trust. And so that's why we urge the committee to keep this model in place. This model is not what's breaking the economy. What's breaking the economy has been identified in this state capture report and the Harvard Inclusive Growth Rate report and so on. in organs of state that have undermined trust. And so, yeah, it should be a very precise location of the problem, which is not here, it's elsewhere, and addressing of the problem, which is not here, but elsewhere. And then finally, this question that I want to close with that was posed twice, and I'm really grateful for it, is should there be coordination between fiscal decision-making and monetary decision-making? And the answer is an unequivocal yes. There must be coordination. The next question is, at what level? And the answer is provided by the Constitution, which is the supreme law of South Africa. It sets the mandate for the Reserve Bank, which effectively is setting the form of cooperation or coordination between the monetary side of statecraft and the fiscal side. 223 and 224 of the Constitution address SARB. 213 through 217 address Treasury. 217 being procurement, 213 through 216 being even more tightly Treasury specific. So that part of the Constitution is laying out how the coordination should work. And part of what it lays out is a difference in a decentralization of power. Our Constitution could have said, look, the Treasury, the minister in charge of Treasury will table the money bills, will propose the budget every year, and will also decide what the inflation target is every year and adjust in interest rates according to her or his determination of what will best satisfy that on an ongoing basis. The Constitution could have done that. It could have allowed the coordination to occur within one office, within one person. But instead, the Constitution didn't do that. It said there must be coordination, but at what level? At the level of the Constitution. And then that decentralizes the roles and allows for some checks and balances and allows for some interplay, but also achieves this very basic purpose of saying fiscal decisions need to be made on a very regular basis, an annual basis, and part of the reporting process is even more tightly defined than that. And interest rate decisions need to be made also on an even more flexible basis. Interest rates need to be adjustable very rapidly, if need be. But the purpose, yes, sir. Yes, Chair.
When you move towards concluding.
This is my last point. This is my last point. I will conclude my last point.
The budget votes today, there are quite many.
Thank you, Chair. My last point is to say we urge the members of this committee who find themselves wondering, how should monetary policy and fiscal policy be coordinated, to consult the Constitution, which sets the terms for that coordination, and does so in a manner that decentralizes the process for the reason, and I was just concluding with this, that monetary policy needs to be flexible at an even greater rate than fiscal policy. There's a button that can be pushed, so to speak, at a very rapid turnaround time to shift interest rates that doesn't go through the kind of legislative hurdles that annual budgets have to go through. And at the same time, although it's much quicker to push the button, there has to be a much longer term view about how that button gets pushed. And that is why the Constitution creates the mandate and the system that it has done. And the existing system satisfies that mandate on the evidence provided. No evidence has been given against it. That's why we think you should keep this and change to save the rest of the country other things, namely the things that are broken. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Gabriel. Honorable members, this is going to be the procedure moving forward. And just to give you a short background, indeed, the bill was introduced in 2018. In the interval, there were elections, I think in 2019. Then the bill was resuscitated. By then, I think the member of the committee was Rebecca Mhlala from the EFF and Shibambo. The member of the EFF was being assisted by the parliamentary legal team to make sure that the bill complies with all the requirement of drafting. I think Nolutando was amongst those from the legal division who was assisting the member of the EFF. The bill was tabled before the committee, and we called for public hearings. This is the second time that we have public hearings, if I'm not mistaken. Then we discovered that there was no socio-economic impact that was conducted. It is a requirement of a legal process that when the minister, deputy minister, or a member of the National Assembly tables the bill, there has to be SIAS. SIAS is the assessment that helps decision makers to understand the potential consequences, identify mitigation strategies, and make informed choices that balance the economic development with social well-being. So we requested, because at that time we were not sure who was supposed to do it, and then it was agreed that in this regard, it has to be the PBO that should conduct the socio-economic impact of the bill. Because if a bill comes from the minister, the presidency issues a certificate for SIAS. Because this is a bill coming from a member and not from the executive. It can't be the presidency that issues a SIAS certificate. So we had to clear that. Indeed, the PBO conducted the SIAS. You remember that they published the report last year, September, and were satisfied with that process because we wanted to make sure that the bill complies in terms of all the stages that it has to follow. So that's the process from where since the bill was tabled. So moving forward, now that we have had these public hearings, we'll have another session where the member of the EFF, I don't know, they will decide who will be that, will respond to all the submissions. We'll determine whether it is next week or that other week, working closely with the member. If it was a bill coming from the minister, you know that it will be National Treasury, the minister coming to respond to all the submissions. So in this regard, the member of the EFF will work closely with PBO and legal divisions to assist him or her to respond to these submissions. From there, we are going to what we call vote on a motion of desirability. A motion of a desirability is a parliamentary procedure that assesses whether a particular bill is desirable. It is used to debate and vote on the merits of a proposal before deciding on its feasibility or implementation. The motion of desirability helps to evaluate the potential benefits, drawbacks, and implications of the bill and allowing for an informed decision making by the members. So after voting on the motion of desirability, we'll submit the report through we'll ATC the report for the National Assembly to debate that report. And then the National Assembly will make a final decision whether adopt or reject the bill. So we can't preempt what will be the outcome. So that's the process so far with this bill, where how it was processed previously to be where we are and moving forward. So that's where we are. Do we have announcements before we close? I mean, we adjourn the meeting.
No announcement at this stage, sir.
Okay. So, Honorable Mautwe, you will have to decide as to who is going to work closely with the legal division to assist you to respond to these submissions, so that when we come back, you will have to make the presentation, and then we take it from there. Are you still there, Mautwe?
Yes, Copy Chair. I was actually hoping that, seeing that the time is still on our side, maybe we can get the last round from members to engage. But Chair, it's up to you. I'm happy that we will have the opportunity to respond to all the submissions, but it's entirely up to you. I just see that it's still past 11. The meeting was scheduled until 12, but we're in your hands, Chair.
Let's round up. I see, like myself, I have to attend the 2 budget votes after this meeting. I still have to get a buzz from here. Let's round up. We'll meet again next week or that other week when you will come back to respond to the submissions. Then we'll engage again, and we'll engage when we debate the motion of desirability. Thanks very much, honorable members, stakeholders, parliamentary teams present here, and the media. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Chairperson.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chairperson.
Recording stopped.